June 10th, 1944. Normandy. The morning air is still thick with the smell of cordite and crushed hedgerow. A column of Panzer IVs crawls along a narrow dirt lane, engines rumbling under the weight of armor and exhaustion. Dust rises in slow motion through shafts of early sunlight. Somewhere, a radio crackles, terse German voices trying to make sense of the chaos that has followed the landings. Then it comes. A low, distant roar that grows with terrifying clarity. Not the deep drone of a bomber, but a high, piercing snarl that makes the men in the turrets glance upward, hands frozen on their controls. Out of the sun, silver streaks descend, P-51 Mustangs, their wings glittering with invasion stripes. The lead aircraft banks sharply, sunlight flashing across its fuselage. Then the sound, the ripping thunder of .50 caliber Brownings. The lane erupts in fire and dust. A tank lurches sideways, smoke billowing from its engine deck. Another bursts into flames as tracer rounds rake its exposed flank. In the space of 30 seconds, silence returns. Only black smoke drifts through the hedges. That week, across Normandy, the German Panzer crews gave the enemy a new name, der fliegende Tod, the flying death. The skies had turned against them. The war before, the skies turned silver. By the summer of 1944, Europe was burning on every front. The Eastern Front had consumed millions, and in the West, the Allies were preparing the final blow, Operation Overlord. The invasion of Nazi-occupied France was not simply an amphibious landing. It was the return of a storm that had been gathering for years in the skies above England. Since 1940, the Luftwaffe had dominated European airspace, unleashing destruction across Poland and the Soviet Union. But by 1944, that supremacy had withered. The once proud Jagdgeschwader wings, Germany's elite fighter groups, were now shadows of their former selves, starved of fuel, pilots, and hope. Allied bombers, escorted by a new generation of fighters, roamed deep into the Reich almost unchallenged. Among those fighters, one would come to define the air war over France, the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally conceived in 1940 for the British Royal Air Force, the Mustang was not born from American design philosophy alone. It was an Anglo-American hybrid of necessity. Its early versions, powered by the Allison engine, were fast, but lacked high-altitude performance. Everything changed when Rolls-Royce engineers fitted it with the Merlin engine, the same heart that powered the legendary Spitfire. The result was transformative. Suddenly, the Mustang could match and often outperform the Luftwaffe's best, the Bf-109 and FW-190, at every altitude. By early 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force had turned to the P-51 as its long-range guardian. Its range, stretching over 1,500 kilometers, allowed bombers to reach Berlin and return with fighter escort, something no previous Allied aircraft could do. For the bomber crews who had once flown unprotected into the teeth of the Reich's air defenses, the sight of those sleek, silver fighters was salvation. But the P-51's role did not end in the cold stratosphere over Germany. It evolved. When the invasion of Normandy was planned, Allied commanders knew that air superiority was not enough. To hold the beaches, to advance inland, they needed air dominance. They needed to own the sky so completely that German armor, transport, and reinforcements could not move without being seen and destroyed. That responsibility fell in large part to the Mustang. By June 1944, thousands of aircraft, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Typhoons, Lightnings, and Mustangs filled the airfields of southern England. Each day before the invasion, reconnaissance flights mapped every road, bridge, and railway across northern France. Luftwaffe opposition was sporadic. German radar stations detected the buildup, but their once efficient communication network was fractured by sabotage and bombing. The Reich's fighter strength had been bled dry defending its own cities. On June 6th, as Allied forces stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy, the P-51s were overhead, sweeping for any sign of the Luftwaffe. Few came. The few German fighters that did rise were met by disciplined squadrons that intercepted them before they could threaten the invasion fleet. The Mustangs patrolled at altitude, then dropped low, hunting trains, convoys, and armored columns that attempted to reinforce the front. This was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, the destruction of movement itself. Every road, every rail line, every bridge leading towards the beaches became a death trap. Within days, German commanders realized that daylight movement was impossible. Even a single vehicle kicking up dust could draw the attention of a Mustang pilot scanning the terrain from above. The Luftwaffe, paralyzed by shortages, could offer no meaningful resistance. The balance had reversed completely. What began as an escort fighter for bombers had now become the blade that cut German logistics into pieces. And yet, the real test was still to come. Because the Normandy countryside, with its narrow lanes, dense hedgerows, and trapped armor divisions, would soon reveal just how devastating that transformation could be. The trap of the Bocage. The terrain of Normandy was unlike anything the German High Command had anticipated. It was not the open plains of the Eastern Front or the broad highways of France. It was a maze, a patchwork of hedgerows, ancient earth embankments, and sunken lanes that could conceal a tank one moment and expose it the next. For German Panzer commanders, it seemed, at first, an advantage. Hedgerows provided cover from Allied artillery and observation. A well-camouflaged Panther could ambush advancing Shermans at 50 meters. The terrain slowed the Allied advance, forcing them into close-range fighting. But what looked like a defensive gift became a nightmare once the skies filled with Allied aircraft. By the second week of June, the Luftwaffe was effectively absent from Normandy. Its once feared fighter wings were grounded by lack of fuel, spare parts, and pilots. Allied air patrols ruled the sky from dawn to dusk. The roar of engines overhead became a constant reminder that movement meant risk, and risk meant death. The P-51 Mustang was not initially designed for ground attack. Its aerodynamic purity, long range, and high speed had been conceived for air superiority and escort. But the demands of Normandy transformed it into something new, a precision predator. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and, when necessary, 500-pound bombs or high-velocity rockets, the Mustang could destroy almost any soft or lightly armored target it found. Unlike the British Typhoon or the American P-47 Thunderbolt, both of which specialized in low-altitude strike missions, the P-51 brought speed, altitude flexibility, and long-range endurance. Pilots could cover vast areas of countryside, loiter for reconnaissance, then strike targets of opportunity before returning to base in England or newly captured airfields in France. To German soldiers on the ground, it seemed omnipresent. Silent one moment, deafening the next. Reports from panzer divisions began to echo the same grim message. Bewegung am Tage ist Selbstmord, meaning movement by day is suicide. Commanders resorted to night marches, hiding vehicles under trees or within barns by day. Fuel convoys moved only under cover of darkness, headlights doused, engines whispering through the dark countryside. Even then, Allied night fighter patrols and reconnaissance aircraft made concealment uncertain. For the Allies, this dominance of the air was a logistical and psychological weapon. Every destroyed bridge delayed a counterattack. Every burning convoy meant fewer tanks reaching the beaches. The Wehrmacht's highly coordinated structure, dependent on movement, communication, and precision timing, began to fracture. Orders were delayed, reinforcements stranded, divisions cut off. The P-51s were not working alone. They were part of a coordinated machine, the Allied Tactical Air Forces.
Every bombing raid, every strafing run was integrated with intelligence gathered from photo reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and ground spotters. Mustang pilots received real-time updates about German convoys or armored formations on the move. They were instructed to disrupt, not merely destroy. The aim was paralysis. By June 10th, only 4 days after D-Day, the Allies had achieved what German generals had once believed impossible: total control of the Normandy airspace. General Gunther Blumentritt later recalled that the effect of Allied fighter bombers was decisive beyond expectation. Even when attacks did not hit, he wrote, they broke our nerve. Every movement, every message, every order had to be reconsidered under the eyes of the enemy. For German tank crews, especially the veterans of the Eastern Front, it was a disorienting reversal. In Russia, they had fought from positions of power, driving the offensive. In Normandy, they were hunted. The thunder of approaching Mustangs became a sound of dread. They could do nothing but wait, hoping the planes would pass over, praying that the glint of sunlight on armor would not betray them. By mid-June, the psychological toll was immense. Even before the great armored clashes at Villers-Bocage or Caen, German mobility had been broken. The Allied invasion, once vulnerable on the beaches, was now protected by an invisible shield, one that reached across every field, forest, and road in northern France.
The machine, the mind, and the method. 1. The technological angle, the perfect predator. The P-51 Mustang was not simply fast, it was balanced perfection. In a war defined by mass and endurance, it stood apart through elegance and efficiency. The key lay in its marriage of American engineering and British ingenuity. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, a design far ahead of its time, reduced drag and allowed the aircraft to slice through the air with uncanny smoothness. Combined with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it achieved both speed and altitude that few opponents could match. Cruising at 370 miles per hour, capable of exceeding 430, and able to operate effectively above 30,000 feet, it was a machine without equal in 1944. Its 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns provided the punch. Each weapon could deliver a storm of fire capable of tearing through armor plating and vehicles alike. For ground attack missions, pilots carried 500-pound bombs or pairs of high-velocity rockets, transforming a sleek escort fighter into a deadly strike aircraft. Yet what made the P-51 truly terrifying to those on the ground was not its weaponry, but its presence. Its range and endurance meant that no German formation could assume safety beyond the front line. Whether over the beaches of Normandy, the fields near Caen, or the bridges of the Seine, the Mustang could appear, unannounced and unstoppable. It was not just a plane, it was the manifestation of Allied industrial supremacy. An aircraft that symbolized the shift from attritional warfare to technological dominance. The Germans had built superb machines, the FW-190, the Me-262, the Panther, the Tiger. But they were machines of precision, not abundance. The Allies had learned to combine both. And in that combination, the P-51 became not just a weapon of air superiority, but of inevitability. 2. The tactical angle, from escort to executioner. In the early stages of 1944, P-51 units were tasked with bomber escort, protecting the B-17s and B-24s that pounded Germany's industrial heartland. But as the Luftwaffe collapsed, commanders saw a new opportunity to wield their fighters as instruments of interdiction. The Mustang's speed and agility allowed it to descend from high-altitude escort patrols into low-level strafing runs with deadly precision. Squadrons were briefed daily on targets behind enemy lines, supply convoys, troop columns, trains, bridges. Intelligence officers marked photographs with pencil lines, the routes German reinforcements would likely use. Pilots were told, find them and stop them.
Unlike the lumbering bombers, Mustangs could operate independently, choosing when and where to strike. Pilots developed their own methods. Some flew in pairs, one attacking, the other covering. Others coordinated rolling assaults, diving in waves to sustain pressure on a target. When the invasion began, these tactics turned the countryside into a deadly chessboard. German tanks were trapped in daylight, and even at dusk, the rumble of engines could draw the attention of roving patrols. Pilots used roads, rivers, and even railway lines as navigation guides, hunting from dawn until fuel and ammunition forced them home. Their success came from discipline as much as daring. Each squadron understood the broader purpose, not just to destroy, but to deny movement. A single destroyed bridge could stall an entire division. A strafed fuel truck could halt a panzer regiment for days. It was war by paralysis, not the grand sweeping maneuvers of Guderian's blitzkrieg, but its mirror image, a slow suffocation from the sky. 3. The human angle, the pilots of the flying death. Behind every polished Mustang stood a man, often young, sometimes barely 20. Many had trained in the United States, learning the vast discipline of air combat before being sent to England, where months of rain, cold, and waiting sharpened their focus. They lived in small wooden huts on temporary airfields across southern England, Bottisham, Devon, Leiston, Bodney. Every dawn, a chalkboard revealed their assignments: bomber escort, reconnaissance, or, after June 6th, armed reconnaissance, a euphemism for free hunting missions over France. The work was relentless. The flights could last 6 hours, often over enemy territory, where a single hit could mean death or capture. The pilots learned to trust their machines and their wingmen completely. They spoke in clipped radio codes, lived on coffee and cigarettes, and endured the mental toll of seeing what their weapons did below, the flashes, the explosions, the scattered human shapes. Yet for many, there was also pride, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Mustang had become a symbol of control, of a turning tide in a war that had once seemed endless. In their diaries, pilots described the exhilaration of flight, the loneliness of long-range missions, and the moral weight of victory. Captain James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group wrote, "The sky feels infinite, but death finds you in inches." They knew the men below were soldiers like themselves, trapped, exposed, afraid. But their mission left no room for mercy. To spare an enemy convoy was to endanger the soldiers fighting on the beaches. The pilots had one job: to ensure that no German tank reached Normandy intact. By the time the first week of the invasion ended, they had done exactly that. The P-51 had proven it could hunt at will, fast enough to evade flak, strong enough to strike, and agile enough to vanish into the clouds before the smoke cleared. But for the men beneath those wings, the German crews, that first week was only the beginning of their nightmare. The enemy, the fear, and the fallout. 4. The enemy's angle, the Panzer crews beneath the sky. In the diaries or German tank crews from June 1944, a pattern appears: the shift from confidence to disbelief. Many of them had fought on the Eastern Front, facing Soviet artillery and the endless steppe. They were veterans of Kursk, Kharkov, Smolensk, men who believed in the resilience of their armor. But Normandy was different. In the Bocage country, visibility was short. The enemy could be anywhere, behind a hedge, beyond a tree line, or high above, invisible in the sun. The roar of a Merlin engine became a warning that time was running out. German anti-aircraft defenses were thin. The 20mm and 37mm flat guns, effective against slow bombers or low-flying aircraft, struggled to track the diving Mustangs. The P-51's attacks came fast and shallow, often from unexpected angles. Pilots used the sun to mask their approach, diving at nearly 400 miles per hour before pulling up sharply. For the men below,
It was over before they could fire. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division, intercepted after the war, describe entire convoys destroyed by fighter bombers with white noses. Tankers referred to them as Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bombers. But the nickname soon changed. Survivors of repeated attacks began calling them de fliegende Tod, the flying death. It was more than a phrase. It was a reflection of helplessness. The Luftwaffe could not protect them, and camouflage was only temporary relief. Movement by day was suicide. Staying still risked discovery by reconnaissance aircraft. They were trapped between immobility and annihilation. One Panther gunner wrote in his diary near Villers-Bocage, "We no longer fear tanks, we fear the sky. The sky kills everything." The myth of German invincibility, the legend of the unstoppable Panzer, was crumbling under the relentless precision of Allied air power. 5. The psychological angle, the war for nerves. For soldiers, fear is constant but manageable. It becomes a rhythm: artillery, movement, return fire. But air power changes the rhythm. It removes control. German tankers in Normandy were fighting a war in which they could not fight back. Each dawn, they listened for the distant hum of engines, knowing what it meant. Even when no attack came, the tension remained. Every bird shadow, every glint of light on metal could trigger panic. This was not accidental. Allied planners understood that psychological warfare could be achieved through presence alone. The constant roar of aircraft, the sight of contrails above, the knowledge that their every movement could be seen. These were weapons in themselves. Interrogations of captured German officers after the battle reveal a recurring statement: the air was everywhere. They described it not as an opponent, but as an environment, an element like fire or water, one that consumed everything exposed to it. In one field report, an officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote, "We have no protection. The men cannot rest. They sleep in holes. They fear the dawn." The psychological toll rippled upward. Commanders found themselves unable to coordinate units effectively. Messages could not be delivered in daylight. Trucks carrying ammunition were destroyed before reaching the front. Every delay fed frustration. Every loss eroded the will to counterattack. When General Geyer von Schweppenberg attempted to regroup his panzer forces for a coordinated counteroffensive, Allied fighter bombers shattered his command post near Caen on June 10th. He survived, but much of his staff did not. The blow was not only physical, but organizational, a paralysis of command. The German army was trained for movement, momentum, and clarity. The air war over Normandy replaced those virtues with hesitation, confusion, and fear. 6. The strategic angle, air power as the new artillery. The story of the P-51 Mustang in Normandy was not one of isolated heroics, but of a coordinated doctrine, air interdiction as strategy. From the highest level of Allied command, air superiority was not a luxury. It was the foundation of victory. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, under Eisenhower, viewed the air arm not as support, but as the first strike. Before ground offensives were launched, before tanks rolled forward, the sky was cleared and shaped to the Allies' will. The Mustang, with its range and flexibility, became the scalpel of that strategy. While the heavy bombers pounded railway yards and ports deep inside France, P-51s and other fighters cut the arteries of supply in the field. They were the eyes and the sword of Allied ground forces. The effect on German operations was devastating. Panzerlehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, attempted to reach the front from Le Mans. Continuous air attacks destroyed fuel trucks, half-tracks, and ammunition carriers along the route. By the time the division reached combat near Caen, its strength was already reduced by nearly half, not through battle, but attrition from the sky. German strategists tried to adapt. Orders were issued for camouflage discipline, dispersion of columns, and night movement. But every adaptation came with a cost: slower deployment, longer response times, increased mechanical breakdowns. The Wehrmacht's vaunted speed was gone. Allied planners noted this transformation with precision. The air campaign's purpose was never to annihilate the German army outright, but to render it unable to act. By denying it mobility, they stripped it of initiative. This was the essence of modern war: victory through denial of mobility. And the P-51, the Flying Death, was its most elegant executioner. By mid-June, within a single week of D-Day, the German army in Normandy was no longer maneuvering in daylight. The front was static, not because of ground combat alone, but because the very act of movement had become fatal. The stage was set for the decisive moment, the week when air power turned the tide irreversibly.
The week the sky burned, June 10th to June 14th, 1944. 7 days that changed the meaning of warfare in Western Europe. In those days following D-Day, as the Allies struggled inland from the beaches, the real destruction came not from artillery or tanks, but from the air. The P-51 Mustang, once the high-altitude guardian of bomber formations, now became the vanguard of a new kind of killing ground. At first light on June 10th, the orders went out from forward air control units stationed in Normandy and southern England. The mission: interdict enemy armor and transport moving toward Caen and Saint-Lô. By then, reconnaissance photos had revealed long lines of German reinforcements trying to reach the front. Columns of Panthers, Tigers, and supply trucks snaked through villages, exposed, slow, and visible. The Mustangs moved in pairs and flights of 4, flying low under the morning haze. They were guided not by radar, but by sight: the glint of metal on a road, the reflection of sunlight on a tank's turret, the dust trail of engines beneath the hedgerows. Pilots used simple hand-drawn maps, memorizing every bend of the Orne and every crossroad near Falaise. When they struck, it was with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a storm. At 9:30 hours near Villers-Bocage, a reconnaissance Mustang of the 354th Fighter Group spotted a column of German half-tracks and tanks attempting to cross an open field toward Caen. Minutes later, 2 squadrons of P-51s arrived overhead. Diving from 6,000 feet, they opened fire with synchronized 50-caliber guns, cutting through the lead vehicles in seconds. Bombs followed, 2 500-pounders that turned the lane into a wall of black smoke. Survivors scrambled for cover as more aircraft arrived. One German report from the 2nd Panzer Division recorded, quote, "total chaos, loss of vehicles, confusion of command." Within an hour, 30 vehicles had been destroyed, among them several fuel trucks whose explosions lit the horizon for miles. But it was not just one strike. All across Normandy that week, the same pattern repeated. Near Argentan, Mustangs shredded a convoy of trucks carrying ammunition to the front. At Évry, they hit rail cars loaded with tanks from the 21st Panzer Division. By June 12th, the roads from Le Mans and Falaise were littered with wreckage: burnt-out hulks of armor, blackened convoys, twisted rails. For the Germans, the destruction was more than material. It was psychological annihilation. Every road felt watched, every movement doomed. Tank crews began painting tree branches and grass on their turrets, hiding under bridges by day and moving only under moonlight. Yet even that offered no true protection. The Allies had begun flying night reconnaissance missions, using flares and radar to mark potential targets for the next morning's attack. Luftwaffe attempts to intervene failed catastrophically. The few FW-190s that rose from airfields in France were quickly intercepted. Allied radar, coordination, and sheer numbers made survival almost impossible. One German pilot later described his squadron's mission as a flight into death. The Allied pilots, meanwhile, grew ruthless and efficient. They no longer searched for duels in the sky. They hunted what moved on the ground. Reports came in daily: locomotives destroyed, tank transporters halted, bridges cut. Some missions were so effective that ground units could barely advance through the wreckage they had created. On June 13th, the 357th Fighter Group recorded one of the most concentrated ground attacks of the campaign. Operating west of Caen, they engaged a German armored battalion caught in open terrain. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the pilots counted more than 40 vehicles burning: tanks, trucks, half-tracks. None had fired a shot in return. A single German officer who survived wrote bitterly afterward, "We did not fight, we were executed." For the Allies on the ground, the results were immediate. Infantry advancing inland began to notice that resistance was sporadic. German counterattacks failed to arrive in strength. Armored divisions that should have reached the front by the 10th or 11th were delayed for days or annihilated before arrival. Commanders in the field called it the invisible artillery, strikes that arrived without warning and left no survivors. By June 14th, the battle lines had not yet dramatically shifted on the ground, but the war's balance had changed irrevocably. The German army, once a master of rapid maneuver, had been rendered static. Its divisions were pinned, its supplies strangled, its commanders paralyzed by fear of the sky. The P-51 Mustang, in its first week over Normandy, had achieved what no tank or gun could. It had turned mobility into vulnerability. And in the days that followed, that vulnerability would become destruction on a scale the Wehrmacht had never faced before.
The collapse of movement. By the night of June 14, 1944, the German front in Normandy was still intact on the map: lines, symbols, divisions. But in the fields and roads that connected those symbols, chaos reigned. Columns that were supposed to counterattack had vanished. Communications between headquarters and forward units were patchy at best. It was not a retreat, not yet, but paralysis. In this paralysis, the P-51 Mustang had become omnipresent. Every dawn began with the same rhythm. The airfields of southern England roared awake. Ground crews fueled and armed the Mustangs, while pilots gathered for briefing. Targets were drawn on maps in thick pencil strokes: fuel columns near Falaise, bridge crossing St. Lo, armored transport south of Caen. Within an hour, the first formations were airborne, climbing into the cold blue sky over the Channel. At 10,000 feet, sunlight flashed off invasion stripes, black and white bands painted hastily before D-Day to prevent friendly fire. Below them, the smoke of Normandy was visible even from that altitude. Scattered columns, artillery bursts, the glint of rivers cutting through farmland. When they reached their hunting grounds, the Mustangs dropped low. Some flew so low that their wingtips clipped treetops. The air smelled of burnt oil and cordite. Each dive was a moment of control, a brief mastery of the battlefield. On June 15th, the 352nd Fighter Group struck near St. Lo, catching an entire German supply convoy halted by a destroyed bridge. Trucks were jammed nose to tail. Ammunition wagons lined the roadside. Within minutes, the first wave of P-51s turned the line into a chain of explosions. Survivors ran into the fields. Strafing runs followed, cutting them down as they fled. A single sortie had crippled an entire regiment's supply for days. Elsewhere, near Argentan, the 354th Pioneer Group executed what historians later called one of the first modern interdiction strikes. They targeted a narrow rail line carrying reinforcements toward the front. Bombs severed the track at multiple points. When repair crews arrived hours later, more Mustangs appeared, strafing them, scattering the workers. By evening, no train moved within 50 miles. For the Wehrmacht, the consequences were cumulative and catastrophic. Every destroyed bridge, every delayed convoy compounded the failure of coordination. Panzer Lehr Division, already battered by earlier air attacks, found itself unable to concentrate enough strength for a counterstrike. Its commander, General Fritz Behrlein, sent a desperate signal to headquarters: no movement possible by day. Enemy aircraft constant.
German generals began issuing surreal orders: move only through forests, camouflage with hay, scatter vehicles. Entire battalions were broken into small groups, each trying to find shelter. But dispersal meant weakness. Tanks hiding in barns could not fight. Infantry traveling in small numbers could not defend. The few Luftwaffe aircraft that tried to intervene, FW-190s, Me-109s, and even the occasional Me-262 jet, were hunted down. Allied radar networks detected them almost instantly. Mustang pilots often intercepted the attackers before they reached their targets, sometimes destroying them as they were taking off. The Luftwaffe had ceased to be a force. It was now a symbol of lost power. The German ground troops felt that loss in their bones. Many accounts describe the same ritual. At the first hint of engine noise, soldiers froze. Some dropped to the ground, others drove their tanks under trees or into depressions. When the roar passed overhead, they waited, often for hours, before daring to move again. This fear destroyed discipline. March schedules collapsed, supply timetables disintegrated, and even messages between units were delayed until nightfall. One division recorded a 3-day delay in orders reaching the front simply because couriers could not risk the open roads. By June 18th, after just 12 days of continuous air interdiction, the German High Command admitted what was unthinkable only months earlier: Normandy could not be reinforced effectively by day. The great armored counterblow that Hitler demanded, the counterstroke that was to throw the Allies back into the sea, never came. It existed only in theory, strangled by the reality of Allied air supremacy. General Rommel, commanding Army Group B, reported to Berlin that the front could not be stabilized. In his dispatch, he wrote, "The enemy's air force dominates the battlefield to an extent hitherto unknown in warfare. Our troops are powerless against it." Rommel's words were not exaggeration. They were the summation of every burning convoy, every stranded tank, every dead driver on the road to Caen. For the P-51 pilots, it was a strange kind of victory. They saw little of the enemy directly. They did not engage in duels or dogfights. Their war was abstract: dots on a map, columns of smoke in a valley, explosions in the distance. Yet they understood what they were doing. Each mission report, each target destroyed, every railway cut, it all built towards something larger: the dismantling of the German war machine from the air downward. By the third week of June, the phrase "flying death" was circulating through captured German communications. Not an official codename, not propaganda, a spontaneous expression from men who had seen their world collapse under the silver wings of a new kind of weapon. The old logic of warfare, that ground could be held if men and machines were brave enough, no longer applied. Normandy proved that the side that ruled the sky ruled the battlefield itself. And by mid-June 1944, that sky belonged completely to the Mustang.
The cost of air supremacy. By the end of June 1944, the physical evidence of what Allied air power had achieved lay scattered across the roads and fields of Normandy. From Falaise to Saint-Lô, from Caen to Avranches, thousands of wrecks marked the landscape: burned-out trucks, shattered half-tracks, overturned fuel carriers, and tanks gutted by fire. The smell of scorched metal and oil hung in the air for weeks. Allied air reports cataloged the destruction with clinical precision. Between June 6th and June 30th, the U.S. 9th Air Force and the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force flew over 70,000 sorties in support of the invasion. Hundreds of those were P-51 Mustang missions. In that time, more than 1,000 German armored vehicles and nearly 3,000 trucks were confirmed destroyed or disabled by air attack. Bridges, supply depots, and rail junctions had been systematically erased.
To the soldiers advancing on the ground, it was clear what this meant. "The sky did our work for us," one British infantry officer wrote in his field journal. "Every time we moved forward, we found the enemy already broken, not by our guns, but by theirs." The German army's logistics were unraveling faster than its generals could react. Entire divisions, cut off from fuel or ammunition, could no longer maneuver effectively. A Tiger tank without fuel was a fortress without walls, impressive but useless. Many were abandoned and later found with holes blown in their fuel tanks or engines dismantled to prevent capture. Captured German documents from late June reveal the despair spreading through the command structure. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division reported losing 70% of its transport vehicles to Allied air attacks before even reaching the front line. The 2nd Panzer Division described continuous fighter-bomber harassment, movement impossible by day, severe losses in personnel and equipment. Yet the physical toll was only part of the story. The psychological collapse was just as complete. German morale, once rooted in confidence in their armor and mobility, had been shattered. Soldiers wrote home describing the P-51s and Typhoons as hunters who see everything. One Panzer officer confessed after the war, "It was like being in the open sea, waiting for the sharks." Meanwhile, for the Allies, success bred new confidence. Air superiority was no longer a concept. It was a living reality, visible and audible every hour of every day. Pilots who had once flown escort missions now roamed with purpose and precision, targeting enemy movements without direct orders. The coordination between air and ground had matured into an art. Forward air controllers moved with the infantry, calling in strikes within minutes of spotting targets. It was warfare in 3 dimensions: fluid, responsive, devastating. The cost to the Allies was not light. Dozens of pilots were lost to flak, crashes, or accidents in the tight, dangerous altitudes of low-level flight. The fields of Normandy claimed both tank and plane alike. But the strategic value of those sacrifices was undeniable. Every downed Mustang represented 100 German vehicles that never reached their destination. By July, even before the breakout at St. Lo, Allied commanders knew that air power had already decided the campaign's outcome. The German army was fighting with broken arteries. Its formations remained on maps, but no longer existed as coherent mobile forces. The name "Flying Death," whispered among the panzer crews that first week, had spread throughout the German lines. It captured the essence of the new reality, that destruction no longer came only from what you could see ahead, but from what you could not escape above. And for those who survived that June, the memory of those silver wings and the scream of the Merlin engine would linger long after the smoke cleared.
The shattered counterattack. By early July 1944, the German High Command faced an unspoken truth. The war in the West had shifted irreversibly. The Wehrmacht, once feared for its speed and coordination, had been reduced to static defense. Its vaunted Panzer divisions, the iron spearheads of Blitzkrieg, were now little more than stranded islands amid fields of wreckage. When Hitler demanded a counterattack to throw the Allies back into the sea, his generals could only nod in obedience. On paper, the divisions still existed. In reality, their tanks lay hidden beneath trees, their trucks burned out on French roads, and their crews lived under constant fear of the sky. Rommel understood the futility.
In a letter to his wife on July 15th, he wrote, "We can no longer move in daylight. Even the smallest unit that shows itself is attacked immediately. The enemy's air force sees everything." His reports to Berlin became increasingly bleak, describing a battlefield dominated not by men or armor, but by an ever-present enemy above. The Luftwaffe could not alter this balance. Its remaining fighters, once the pride of the Reich, were grounded by lack of fuel. Even the revolutionary Me-262 jet, introduced too late and in too few numbers, could do little to stem the tide. The air war over Normandy had become a one-sided annihilation. The P-51 Mustang stood at the center of this new reality. It was not the only aircraft inflicting damage. The British Typhoon and American Thunderbolt were devastating ground attack machines, but the Mustang's combination of speed, reach, and precision made it the hunter that arrived first and stayed longest. It could sweep ahead of the front line, search deep behind enemy territory, and return with the kind of detailed visual intelligence that changed the rhythm of battle. By late July, this dominance had created the conditions for Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy. The Germans, pinned by air and artillery, could no longer regroup effectively. Their armored reserves were trapped in what had become a killing ground of their own making. When Cobra began on July 25th, the Allies unleashed a massive aerial bombardment, followed by a swift armored advance. German counterattacks failed instantly, not because of poor tactics, but because their logistics were already dead. Every attempt to move fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements was detected and destroyed. In the chaos that followed, thousands of German soldiers abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. Panzer crews blew up their own tanks rather than watch them burn under Mustang fire. The once proud formations that had rolled triumphantly through France in 1940 were now being hunted through those same fields by the very machines that symbolized Allied supremacy. Historians later noted that the German army in Normandy was defeated twice, once on the ground and once in the air. The second defeat made the first inevitable. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 2,000 aircraft. German ground forces suffered over 250,000 casualties, including prisoners, and thousands of armored vehicles were lost. Many never reached combat. The Allies, on the contrary, had achieved near-total operational freedom. Supply convoys moved safely, communications flowed. Every offensive was coordinated under the assurance that the skies belonged to them. Among the German survivors, a grim folklore emerged. Tales of Mustangs appearing without warning, descending like falcons on convoys, strafing a single vehicle before vanishing into the clouds. Soldiers began referring to the sound of the P-51's approach as the whistle of death. For many, it was the last sound they heard. In the aftermath, captured officers reflected on the change that had overtaken modern warfare. General Bayerlin of Panzer Lehr summed it up best. "It was not the enemy tanks that defeated us, but the fighter bombers. We could not move, we could not fight, we could only hide." By the time the Allies reached Paris in August, the legend of the Flying Death had spread across every German division that had fought and lost in Normandy. The battlefield that had once defined German power had now become the graveyard of its armor, and the silver wings of the Mustang shimmering above the ruins marked the dawn of a new era, one where control of the air meant control of history itself. The sky as the new battlefield. When the smoke of Normandy finally cleared, the war had entered a new dimension, one no longer ruled by tanks, trenches, or sheer manpower. It belonged to the air. For centuries, the ground had been the measure of power. Armies that held it ruled.
But in June 1944, under the gray skies of northern France, that truth was rewritten. The P-51 Mustang had proven that the power to see, reach, and destroy from above could dismantle even the strongest army on Earth. To the German soldiers who endured that first week, the lesson was personal. They had lived through a transformation of warfare, one where bravery, armor, and tactics meant little against an enemy that could strike from the invisible. The phrase "flying death" was not born of propaganda. It was born of experience, of fire and terror, and the realization that the battlefield itself had moved beyond their grasp. The Mustang's victory was not just mechanical. It was symbolic. It represented the fusion of engineering, logistics, and industrial will that defined the Allied war machine. Each sortie was the product of thousands of hands, pilots, mechanics, strategists, and laborers, all linked in a system of war that Germany could no longer match. And yet, amid the triumph, there was something deeper, a warning. The mastery of the sky also revealed the beginning of a new kind of distance in warfare, where destruction could be delivered without seeing the faces of those below. Normandy had shown that the line between heroism and horror was growing thinner, and that the future of battle would belong to those who controlled the unseen. In the decades that followed, the lesson of Normandy became doctrine. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf to the skies of Europe, once again, the principle remained: whoever rules the air decides the fate of the ground. But in that first week of June 1944, none of that was yet written. There were only men on the ground, hearing the rising roar above, and silver wings glinting in the sunlight, the unmistakable sign that the world of war had changed forever. The P-51 Mustang had not just won air superiority, it had defined the future of modern warfare.